to the sixth annual collaboration between Albany Public Library and the Adirondack Zoom series, and this year's Adirondack Moments Zoom series. I'm Meg Kelly, Programs and Partnerships Librarian at Albany Public Library. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. Albany Public Library is situated on the land of the Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. The Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in our regions and practice their teachings and life ways. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Yari Martinez Pule. Yari joined the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in 2022 as a curatorial assistant after completing a Fulbright research grant. Previously, she was a curatorial research fellow at Museo Franz Mayer in Mexico City and a curatorial assistant at ADWSE Gallery, a gallery affiliated with New York University, where she co-curated and organized exhibitions with the Institute of Fine Arts, the Costume Institute, and Steinhardt's Department of Art. In addition, she was a visiting scholar in the archives at Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. She holds an MA from New York University, where she concentrated her research on the historical and cultural dimensions of textiles, and a BA from Marquette University with a focus on art history, digital media studies, and Spanish and Latin American studies, completing part of her art history education from King's College London. Most recently, Yari curated A Circle That Nothing Can Break, an exhibition examining the ways in which Georgia O'Keeffe's unique vocabulary of round forms intersected with feeling, memory, and lived experience. Throughout the evening, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Yari will take questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Yari.
Thank you, Meg. Before we start diving into the slides, I do sort of want to brief everybody with what the crux of this presentation will be. I think some of O'Keeffe's work at Lake George isn't as well known as her work in New York, and even more so as her work made in New Mexico. And full disclosure, I think I let some of the staff at the library and the museum know that I have two dogs and I'm expecting a package. So I do apologize way in advance if you hear my dogs barking in the middle of the presentation. Okay, so without further ado, although scholars have long identified Georgia O'Keeffe's attachment to place as the generative force behind much of her most accomplished work, Lake George is frequently cast as a site of constraint rather than creative flourishing. Such characterizations tend to foreground the persistent interruptions occasioned by Alfred Stiglitz's social circle, the gallerist and photographer who would later become her husband, and whose steady influx of summer visitors sometimes compromised O'Keeffe's need for concentration. As such, within this narrative arc, Lake George can appear less as a creative haven than as a space of aesthetic and emotional tension. Even when these years are interpreted more favorably, critical attention often centers on the aesthetic and poetic reciprocity between O'Keeffe and Stiglitz, framing the site primarily through the lens of artistic partnership. Yet, I also argue that aside from this, Lake George holds deeper significance within O'Keeffe's formal and thematic development. I add that it was here at Lake George, amid the very tensions so frequently noted, that O'Keeffe intensified her engagement with landscape as a central subject rather than as a backdrop, and advanced her exploration of magnified botanical subjects and natural forms, and refined a visual vocabulary of rural iconography. Let's see. There we go. Georgia O'Keeffe's relationship with Lake George was far more than a fleeting encounter. It was her profound and evolving connection that left a lasting imprint on her life and art. Her earliest experiences with the lake preceded the sustained engagement that followed her summers at the Stiglitz's family's 36-acre retreat. Even then, the setting began to shape her sensibilities. O'Keeffe first visited Lake George in 1908, having received a scholarship from the Art Students League in New York City to attend an artist retreat as a young student. Under the guidance of William Merritt Chase, a prominent American painter, she cultivated the confidence and technical mastery that would define her early work. This emerging assurance secured her a summer scholarship at the Amatola Art Camp, situated on the eastern shore of Lake George. Far from the familiar landscapes of her youth, O'Keeffe encountered the lake's landscape and beauty for the first time. Ironically, this was the very body of water that lay opposite to the Stiglitz family enclave, a site that would assume central importance in her personal and artistic life nearly a decade later. A photograph of the young artist rowing upon the lake captures a moment of encounter, while an accompanying period image of Lake George to the other side reveals the area's social and cultural vitality. The presence of prominent figures underscores the lake's dual role as both an artistic hub and as a site of high social engagement, highlighting the environment that would later inform O'Keeffe's artistic vision. A decade after her initial visit to Lake George in 1908, O'Keeffe made a pivotal move to New York City in 1918, marking a significant shift in her life and career. In that same year, she left her teaching position at West Texas State and accepted Alfred Stiglitz's offer to financially support her for a year of focused painting. With his encouragement, she began her journey as a professional artist. In August of this year, 1918, O'Keeffe accompanied Stiglitz on his stay to Lake George in the Hudson River Valley, a place that would become significant in both her personal and professional life. The Stiglitz family's 36-acre retreat provided a needed escape from the hustle and industrialization of New York City. Here, O'Keeffe found not only rest but also inspiration and creative freedom. During this visit, she was warmly welcomed by Stiglitz's family, including his mother, siblings, and extended relatives who were all part of the dynamic at Oakland House, featured here. The photograph here was taken by Stiglitz, capturing the family's 36-acre compound, which became synonymous with their retreat. The Oakland House, with its thick gold frames and marble sculptures, patterned rugs, plush chairs, and heavy drapes, exuded a Victorian atmosphere. While Stiglitz was deeply involved in the modernist movement, elements of Victorian decor still dominated parts of his life, including Oakland House and his New York City apartment. O'Keeffe, however, was not particularly fond of these ornate furnishings, which stood in contrast to her own aesthetic. During her first extended stay at Oakland House, O'Keeffe appeared to have worked with watercolor as her chosen medium, much as she had done during her years as a student and teacher. This is evidenced by a photograph of her from that time, captured by Stiglitz as she worked with watercolors. The medium served as a bridge between her past as an educator and her emerging identity as a professional artist. During the summer of 1918, O'Keeffe encountered the remarkable variety of trees on the Stiglitz property, including the birches and the iconic old maple tree, a landmark immortalized in several of Stiglitz's photographs. With its twisting branches and commanding presence, this majestic tree captured O'Keeffe's imagination and became a central motif in her work. The vibrant energy of summer conveyed through the tree's rich colors and dynamic forms inspired her to dedicate a number of pieces to its study. Her early fascination with trees blossomed during this period, laying the foundation for a lasting engagement with them. At Lake George, trees transcended their role as mere subjects. They embodied companionship, resilience, and enduring strength that resonated deeply with O'Keeffe. Throughout her Lake George years, depictions of trees emerged as a recurring theme, reflecting her connection to place and her evolving vision. Old Tree, seen here, created in the summer of 1918, likely served as an homage to the beloved maple. In this watercolor, O'Keeffe masterfully rendered its twisted limbs and shifting foliage, marking the beginning of her enduring dialogue with the natural world. For Stiglitz, trees held a profound significance as well. He frequently photographed them, portraying everything from a dying chestnut tree he associated with his father to stately maples and poplars, exploring their poetic, solemn, and timeless qualities. Like Stieglitz, O'Keeffe approached trees not merely as visual forms, but as living symbols, capturing both their physical presence and their deeper meanings. Together, their studies reveal a shared admiration for the natural world, expressed through different modes of engagement. The following summer of 1919 at Lake George marked a significant departure in the work of O'Keeffe, distinguishing itself from the previous summer. Some of the pieces she created during this time included the word series in their title, indicating a deliberate, methodical approach to her exploration of form and color. By this time, Alfred Stieglitz had already encouraged O'Keeffe to experiment with oil painting, likely driven by his desire to promote her work in his Manhattan galleries and increase its marketability. As several scholars have pointed out, this shift also marked the decline of O'Keeffe's earlier work in watercolor and charcoal, mediums such as watercolor associated with women's domestic work. The move to oils, more commercially viable, represented both an artistic evolution and a response to broader gendered expectations in the art world. Among her early oil paint experiments, the paintings here stand out. While the individual pieces within vary, they are largely abstract and mark O'Keeffe's bold commitment to oil. Series 1, number 10, 1919, is one such work, and its abstract composition exemplifies her growing mastery in oil, offering a glimpse into her experimental process. In the far left section of this slide, you can see Series 1, number 10, alongside another related oil painting, both sharing similar color palettes yet diverging in form and composition. This pairing illustrates the fluidity with which O'Keeffe was developing her visual language. One of O'Keeffe's favorite pastimes during her time at Lake George was rowing at Tea Island Bay. The activity offered her both solitude from the constant stream of summer guests at Stiglitz's property and a unique vantage point from which to observe nature. The sense of privacy and intimacy that rowing provided is evident in several paintings that stemmed from this recreational activity, including the pair of works shown here. In these, we can detect the darkened silhouette of the mountains, the lush green trees, and perhaps even a suggestion of bent knees in the act of rowing. Another notable work from this period here is Series 1, Blue and White Flower Shapes, 1919, all the way to the right, a quintessential example of O'Keeffe's renowned floral compositions. Known for her iconic flower paintings, which she began producing in the late 1910s and continued throughout the 1920s, O'Keeffe's approach to the subject invites a great deal of speculation about both her personal life and artistic intentions. Series 1, Blue and White Flower Shape, serves as a striking departure from traditional floral still lives, typically associated with 19th century realism. O'Keeffe's abstract renditions take the viewer into an intensely close examination of form, shifting perspective and unsettling expectations. The precise subjectivity of the flower in this work, whether we are looking from the inside or the outside, forces us to reconsider our role as viewers, emphasizing O'Keeffe's insistence on paying attention to small-scale flowers in new ways. Flowers, traditionally linked to femininity and domesticity in art, are subverted by O'Keeffe, who invites a major intimacy with the subject. O'Keeffe's Lake George repertoire also included an array of natural imagery, notably fruit and vegetables. Apples, which flourished abundantly at Lake George, became a particular focus for the artist. She often spent time pruning and canning them. And in a letter to Elizabeth Stiglitz, she remarked, quote, apples everywhere. I am painting apples, end quote. Alongside her growing interest in gardening, O'Keeffe became a collector of organic mementos, shells, stones, leaves, gathered during her long walks in the region. Among these, leaves held particular significance. With the diverse array of trees at Lake George, O'Keeffe found herself surrounded by a constantly shifting palette of colors and textures. These leaves not only captured the changing seasons, but also reflected her own perception of time's passage. Early paintings from Lake George, like the one shown here, feature overlapping beds of leaves, evoking both the natural abundance of the landscape and her intimate connection to it. Although O'Keeffe rarely included animals or people in her work, the presence of a dairy cow is an exception. I really do love this cow painting. Raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and later teaching in Amarillo, Texas, O'Keeffe had familiarity with cattle. This particular cow was likely inspired by one she encountered during her summers at Lake George. The painting reveals O'Keeffe's modernist sensibility, capturing the cow's rounded forms and dynamic posture with the same abstract attention she applied to her other subjects. The period from 1919 to 1922 proved transformative for O'Keeffe and Stiglitz, encompassing not only a prolific phase in their creative output, but also a profound spatial and environmental shift that shaped their artistic trajectories. Following the death of Stiglitz's mother in 1922, the family finalized the sale of the Oakland House, which you earlier saw, with its richly ornamented Victorian interior, while retaining a smaller farmhouse on the property, seen here. The farmhouse, later renovated and known as the Hill, is depicted here to the right. Upon establishing themselves in the farmhouse on the hill, positioned across Bolton Road and overlooking a stretch of the lakeshore, O'Keeffe increasingly devoted herself to landscape painting, predominantly in oil. Her intensified engagement with the landscape was inseparable from the hill's elevated vantage, which afforded sweeping, unobstructed views of the lake and its environment. From her bedroom on the second story front of the farmhouse, she could survey the panorama below, a perspective that became central to her artistic exploration. O'Keeffe's landscapes demonstrate a thoughtful variation of perspective, informed by her observations from the second story windows, which you can see here to the left. She rendered scenes in both the vertical and horizontal formats, experimenting with compositional orientation to capture the interplay of elevation, space, and light. Through these works, the farmhouse and its surroundings were transformed from mere dwelling to an active lens through which she interrogated and reimagined the natural world. Stormcloud, Lake George, stands out as a compelling exploration of the interplay between landscape, weather, and mood in O'Keeffe's body of work. Through a deliberate emphasis on shape and form, she conveys not only the physical forms of the scene, but also its atmospheric quality. Indeed, the farmhouse elevated vantage provided a striking perspective, highlighting the undulating mountain range that frames the background and the central expanse of water that bisected her compositions. In this and other depictions of Lake George's landscapes, one can discern a prefiguration of the New Mexico vistas that would come to define her later work. Both reveal her sustained interest in the shapes and forms of the land, as well as her pursuit of dramatic atmospheric effects, fiery skies, intense light, and elemental forces that imbued her later New Mexican landscape paintings with profound visual intensity. In addition to maintaining a room within the farmhouse, O'Keeffe longed for a studio of her own. one removed from the social bustle of the main house where summer visitors regularly arrived and departed. In the summer of 1920, she began repairing a small outbuilding on the hill, informally known as the shanty, gradually transforming it into a space dedicated to painting. She undertook the restoration with the assistance of Donald Davidson and Elizabeth Stiglitz. By 1922, the repairs were complete, and the shanty became a fully functional, if modest, studio. That same year, O'Keeffe produced a painting devoted to the structure itself, My Shanty, seen here. Alfred Stieglitz also documented the completed building in a series of photographs, preserving the humble studio with his photographic record of life at Lake George. The shanty's rustic construction likely resonated with O'Keeffe on a more personal level as well. Having grown up on a farm in Wisconsin, she was intimately familiar with the architecture of barns, sheds, and other structures that shaped rural life. The act of repairing and inhabiting such a building may therefore have carried an element of continuity with her earlier experiences. At the same time, the studio offered something she lacked within the farmhouse itself, a space of her own. In a house that was not hers, one animated by a very steady influx of guests whose presence she could not always regulate, the shanty afforded a degree of concentration and autonomy essential to her artistic practice. After completing My Shanty, O'Keeffe continued to turn her attention to the built environment of the Stiglitz property, producing 14 additional paintings of barns and other structures on the grounds. Through these works, the architecture of Lake George became not merely a backdrop to her life there, but an enduring subject through which she explored form, structure, and the poetry of bucolic rural buildings. In the summer of 1924, a very important summer, Georgia O'Keeffe planted beds of colored petunias, cultivating them not only as garden flowers, but also as subjects for close visual study. Their luminous color and velvety surfaces soon inspired her first enlarged flower painting, Petunia #2, seen to the right here, a work that anticipates the monumental botanical images now widely regarded as one of her most original contributions to 20th century art. In this painting, O'Keeffe made a decisive compositional shift. She enlarged the blossom dramatically, cropped its form, and eliminated distracting background elements. Although she had painted flowers for many years, she had never before magnified them to such commanding scale. In doing so, she imposed the bold scale and power of modernism onto an often domestic subject and traditional genre. The transformation was both formal and conceptual. O'Keeffe herself felt newly energized by the direction of this work. Reflecting on the paintings of that year, she remarked, quote, I am very much excited over my work this year. It has given me a great time, and some of it I enjoy much, and I really don't enjoy much of my own things. End quote. The sense of creative momentum was accompanied by a growing independence from the turbulence often surrounding Stiglitz and the bustle of the property. Redirecting her attention toward painting, she invested her energy in the practice that sustained her most deeply. A spirit of competition also animated this moment. O'Keeffe knew that these paintings would soon be exhibited alongside works by artists within Stieglitz's circle, figures such as Marsden Hartley, John Marin, Charles Demuth, etc. The flowers of this period therefore stand not only as aesthetic experiments, but also as declarations of artistic conviction, demonstrating O'Keeffe's insistence on remaining faithful to her own instincts within a predominantly male artistic scene. The compositional structure of Petunia #2, to the right and in contrast to the oval painting, also reflects the photographic sensibilities circulating within Stieglitz's artistic circle. By magnifying the flower and organizing through broad planes, O'Keeffe established a dynamic balance between close observation of natural form, cropping and zooming, and an emerging language of abstraction. At the same time, the petunia motif may reveal another practical source of inspiration. Illustrated seed catalogs that O'Keeffe consulted while selecting plants for the orchards and gardens surrounding the Stiglitz's property. Through this convergence of gardening, photography, and painting, the humble petunia became the catalyst for one of the most radical transformations in her artistic practice. And I have these two here so you can really see the difference between the oval painting and then the more magnified botanical um, painting to the right. The following year, Georgia O'Keeffe returned to the purple petunias, magnifying them in the manner that would become characteristic of her botanical paintings. This work belongs to a group of roughly a dozen compositions, varying in scale and perspective, that anticipate the floral studies she developed from living plants over the next several years. These magnified flower paintings quickly captivated the New York art world, and among the many motifs O'Keeffe explored in the 1920s, drew the greatest critical attention. At the same time, her position as a woman artist within a largely male avant-garde became the subject of considerable debate. Critics frequently interpreted her close-up floral imagery through a Freudian lens, an interpretation she firmly rejected. Addressing such readings in the preface to a 1939 exhibition, O'Keeffe explained that she enlarged flowers so viewers would be compelled to slow down and truly look at them. By rendering them on a monumental scale, she hoped even hurried New Yorkers would pause long enough to perceive the visual intensity she found in the natural form. Within the Petunia series, this painting is among the most complex. 6 blossoms appear at different angles and stages of bloom, creating the impression of a single flower unfolding across space and time. O'Keeffe animates each petal with velvety surfaces and crisp outlines, while the immense scale pushes the image toward the threshold between representation and abstraction. The blossoms also fill the composition edge to edge, a compositional strategy she had begun refining the previous year, as we just saw. Other flower paintings of monumental significance included O'Keeffe's depictions of cannas and poppies. In these works, one encounters the same flowers rendered across diverse canvases, each exploring their form, color, and vitality with remarkable intensity. In addition to petunias, the poppy occupies a special place in O'Keeffe's body of work. While seldom associated with her Lake George period, poppies flourished in June on the Stiglitz property along Bolton Road. During the mid-1920s, O'Keeffe produced a series of striking canvases of this flower, culminating in her monumental 1928 poppy painting, celebrated for its scale and vibrancy. Similarly, O'Keeffe painted 20 canvases featuring red cannas. Her enthusiasm for red cannas was well known among the local hill dwellers. This fascination may also have been fueled by the emergence of new and improved varieties that were popular at the time. Among the most celebrated was the Tarrytown canna, which won the gold medal at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, noted for its profuse blooms and brilliant crimson hue. Through her meticulous attention to these flowers, O'Keeffe transformed botanical subjects into compelling studies of color and form. I think that is truly evident in this red canna to the left of this side. But even as O'Keeffe worked at Lake George, often retreating to the small studio known as the Shanty, Alfred Stiglitz continued to photograph the visitors who gathered there each summer, including O'Keeffe herself. By the 1910s and 1920s, photographing people had become an increasingly central concern within Stiglitz's practice. He frequently returned to the same sitters repeatedly, exploring the expressive potential of the face and body across extended photographic sequences. No subject engaged him more persistently than O'Keeffe. At Lake George, he photographed her in a wide range of settings and poses. closely studying the expressive qualities of her hands, arranging her with natural objects such as the leaves she gathered, and producing both nude studies and more conventional portraits. These sessions unfolded across the landscape and interiors of the estate, transforming the site into a kind of stage for photographic experimentation. Stiglitz continued to photograph O'Keeffe from virtually every vantage point, clothed and unclothed, indoors and outdoors, until the final portraits he made in 1936 and 1937. Over the course of their relationship, he produced more than 300 photographs of her. Taken together, this remarkable body of work forms an extended visual record, tracing not only O'Keeffe's physical presence, but also the evolving emotional and artistic dialogue that defined their partnership. The depth and complexity of their creative and personal bond is palpable through the series, making it one of the most sustained and intimate projects in the history of modern photography. Got two photographs here, not taken by Stiglitz, but rather of Alfred Stiglitz photographing O'Keeffe. And you can sort of see this was probably happening on a very regular basis on the property. By 1924, O'Keeffe and Stiglitz had already officially married. In his pursuit of what he described as truth and pure form, Stiglitz undertook an extraordinary photographic project centered on O'Keeffe. For Stiglitz, the essence of O'Keeffe cannot be contained solely within the conventions of portraiture, focused on the face. Instead, he sought expression across the entire body, especially her hands, which he regarded as profoundly revealing of character. Photographs such as this one captures a distinct moment of presence capable of standing independently. Here, O'Keeffe's fingers seem to dance as they hold a cluster of grapes against a window, clearly positioned within the interior of a house. O'Keeffe herself later recalled that her hands had attracted admiration since childhood. Stiglitz, who believed that hands could be as eloquent as the face, returned to them repeatedly with his camera. In other images, her hands also emerge from the photographic print, as though possessing a life of their own. A similar attentiveness appears in his later study of the hands of Rebecca Salisbury James and Rebecca Strand, who I'll talk about in a later slide, in which her body became a site of expressive abstraction. When working with his tripod-mounted view camera, Stiglitz often approached O'Keeffe's body as a dynamic arrangement of angles and curves. A few years later, in 1929, the same year that Georgia O'Keeffe first chose to travel to New Mexico, she meditated on the Alfred Stiglitz family farmhouse overlooking Lake George, specifically the window depicted in Farmhouse Window and Door, seen here. In this canvas, her only painting devoted to the Stiglitz family home, the window is no longer used as a framing device through which the artist gazes outward toward the lake from inside the house. Instead, O'Keeffe confronts the structure directly from the exterior, looking straight at it and seemingly into the window and door. The result is an image that is at once stark and very perplexing. The crisp lines and emphatic right angles of farmhouse window and door reveal a precisionist style within O'Keeffe's work, an aesthetic that contrasts with the sensuous organic forms and color harmonies more commonly associated with her paintings. Here, the austerity of flat planes and color palette conceals a subtle conceptual puzzle. The shutters clearly signal the presence of a window, yet what they frame appears equally to be a door. The composition thus destabilizes our sense of architectural logic, and it seems to blur a spatial configuration. In doing so, the painting plays with spatial ambiguity and with the porous boundary between interior and exterior, between the natural world and the built environment. Such tensions echo deeply with O'Keeffe's experience of the farmhouse itself, a place that mediated between domestic space and the surrounding landscape. Indeed, several of the guests at Lake George were already reflecting on the farmhouse windows in poetic terms. The writer John Toomer, for instance, described them evocatively as, quote, each window is all window the outside can look in. The Lake George landscape, nearby trees, the old red barn, floating clouds, end quote. Seen in this context, it is striking that O'Keeffe's only dedicated painting of the farmhouse was created the very year of her life-altering journey to New Mexico, a place where she would eventually establish a permanent home away from Alfred Stieglitz. Remarkably, this is also the only canvas in which she depicts the house from the outside, painted during that pivotal trip that rooted her so deeply in New Mexico. The work therefore stands as a subtle threshold in her life and career, poised between one landscape that shaped her artistic vision and another that would soon transform it. Although Georgia O'Keeffe's first journey to New Mexico in 1929 is widely regarded as a decisive turning point, one that reoriented her both geographically and artistically, it is important to note that she continued to paint at Lake George until 1934. Her relationship to Lake George shifted in these years, but it did not dissolve upon her encounter with the landscapes of the Southwest. The period following her 1929 trip west with Rebecca Salisbury James, a reverse glass painter who was then married to the photographer Paul Strand, reveals a more complex simultaneity within O'Keeffe's practice. Salisbury James had also spent time at Lake George and was photographed by Alfred Stieglitz, though her artistic ambitions were not fully championed within her circle, except for O'Keeffe, who supported and encouraged her art. In these years, Lake George and New Mexico coexisted in O'Keeffe's work and imagination, the former continuing to serve as a site of disciplined observation and experimentation, even as the latter emerged as an increasingly powerful source of subject matter and artistic identity. A photograph taken by Stiglitz after O'Keeffe's repeated trips to New Mexico following 1929, seen here, captures this very transition. In it, she holds one of the organic forms that would become a defining motif of her New Mexico paintings, likely while standing inside the small lakeside shanty at Lake George where she often worked. The photograph is very foretelling. The art is situated in the environment that had long sustained her practice, yet already holding the subject matter that would come to define the next chapter of her career. Seen in retrospect, the photograph suggests the eventual outcome of this gradual shift. O'Keeffe's decision to establish a permanent home and artistic life in New Mexico apart from Stiglitz. However, many of the formal and conceptual investigations that would later achieve monumental clarity in O'Keeffe's New Mexico paintings were cultivated through this sustained engagement with the Lake George landscape. The precision of her looking, the distillation of form, and the exploration of spatial relationships were practices refined at Lake George before being carried to New Mexico. In several of her leaf and flower compositions, Georgia O'Keeffe introduced slight tears or fissures into the forms. These small ruptures function both as compelling formal devices and as subtle, possibly symbolic gestures. As other scholars have suggested, such delicate breaks may allude to the natural process of decay visible in fallen leaves, while also hinting at more personal tension surrounding her life at Lake George and her relationship with Alfred Stieglitz. The emphasis and forms evident in these works also reflect the enduring influence of her teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow, whose teachings encouraged artists to organize visual elements through the harmony, balance, and expressive design. What becomes increasingly clear during these years, however, is that Lake George was gradually loosening its hold on O'Keeffe's imagination, while New Mexico exerted a growing pull. In 1929, she completed 4 paintings devoted to leaves, and by 1931, she produced a single striking canvas focused on the motif. Dark and lavender leaves concentrated Concentrated and introspective, the painting seen here suggests both continuity with the close study of natural forms that had long characterized her work at Lake George, and a moment of transition as she turned towards New Mexico. Equally significant is the fact that, aside from dark and lavender leaves, O'Keeffe painted what would become her final landscape of Lake George in 1930, Lake George Early Moonrise. This painting stands apart within her Lake George imagery in several notable ways. Many of O'Keeffe's earlier landscapes from the region emphasize the autumn season, yet this work depicts the landscape in the lush greens and luminous yellows of spring. It is also the only Lake George landscape in which O'Keeffe specified a time of day directly in the title, drawing attention to the fleeting moment suggested by the early rising moon. The composition is further distinguished by its vantage point. Unlike many of her earlier views, which positioned the lake and distant hills more prominently, this painting adopts a lower perspective that includes a broad sweep of lawn. This growing element situates the viewer firmly on the grounds of the house on the hill, reinforcing the painting's intimate relationship to the site itself. Yet the work also seems to encapsulate a subtle ambivalence towards the setting. The year after completing the painting, O'Keeffe wrote to the painter Russell Vernon Hunter with a remark that reveals her changing attitude towards the landscape of Lake George. Quote, "I walk much and endure the green, and that is all about there is to it." End quote. The statement hints at a growing restlessness, suggesting that the lush environment, which had long sustained her painting, was beginning to feel constraining. Even as the northern region of New Mexico increasingly captured her imagination. And I just want to mention the little moon that because I don't want anybody to miss the moon. It looks so great in this painting, and it's very small. It's just above the mountain at the very top, almost center, but not quite. O'Keeffe's years at Lake George marked a remarkably fertile period in her artistic career. It was during this time that she honed her magnified botanical studies, delved into landscapes and arboreal subjects, depicted rustic architecture, and produced still lives of exceptional subtlety. It was at Lake George that O'Keeffe produced her most celebrated florals, iconic petunias, poppies, and red cannas, works that would come to define her large body of work. Revered and avidly sought after, these paintings not only consolidated her reputation and often determined the critical and commercial success of her exhibitions, but also shaped the interpretive frameworks through which her art was received. Although these works were frequently subjected to sexualized readings, O'Keeffe's own reflections and explanations remain crucial, revealing her deliberate engagement with the aesthetic and cultural tensions of her time, as she sought to assert a visual language that resisted the encroachments of industrialization amid the bustling energy of early 20th century Manhattan. Equally significant are the photographs of Alfred Stiglitz, produced during this period, which constitute a substantial visual record of Lake George. His lens captured O'Keeffe in a range of contexts, from intimate studies of her hands, torso, and fully unclothed figure, to, perhaps more crucially for understanding her life at Lake George, candid portrayals of her daily activities, gathering leaves, carrying a canvas outdoors, actively gardening, or even getting a haircut while playing with a kitten. His photographs also document the considerable number of visitors to her Lake George home. Taken together, these images form an invaluable collection, offering insight not only into the Lake George environment, the farmhouse, the shanty, but also into O'Keeffe herself, beyond the interpretive frame of Stieglitz's own artistic intentions. Understanding O'Keeffe's time at Lake George is crucial to apprehending both her works as a whole and the trajectory of her subsequent work in New Mexico. Many of her most celebrated subjects trace their origins to this very place, where she delighted in finding new motifs removed from New York City. Lake George also provided a laboratory for experimenting with techniques within her painting practice, reflecting her continual engagement with visual innovation. Still further, beyond its creative significance, Lake George functioned as a space for personal investigation, a place where O'Keeffe deepened her understanding of selfhood and later articulated her own needs. In 1945, a year before Alfred Stieglitz's death, she made one of her final visits to Lake George, journeying from New Mexico to upstate New York. Her final return in 1946 was marked by a profound poignancy as she distributed Stieglitz's ashes beneath the roots of an old tree at the water's edge. As she matured in New Mexico, O'Keeffe became increasingly resolute in her preference for that place over any other. For the first time in many years, she possessed the support and stability to construct her own home in Abiquiu, New Mexico, free from the transient life of New York apartments or shared spaces at the Stiglitz Lake George compound, with only her small studio in the shanty remaining as a place that felt like it was her own. Still further, while her garden at Abiquiu in New Mexico stands as a testament to her enduring affinity for the natural world, it is evident that her horticultural knowledge and sensibilities were honed at Lake George, where she cultivated both plant life and artistic insight. Ultimately, Abiquiu in New Mexico emerged as a shelter in which O'Keeffe could integrate the demands of life, work, and social engagement on her own terms, arranging and shaping her environment according to her impulses and aesthetic vision. Yet, it was at Lake George that she first discerned her needs, clarified her interests, and laid the groundwork for the independence that would define her later years. Thank you.
Thank you, Yari. That was wonderful. We have some questions from our participants. Um, our first question we got was about a specific painting. They were curious to know the scale and size of canvas that O'Keeffe worked on during this period, and the painting was the poppy and the red canna.
Yeah, the red canna.
Hmm.
That I don't know. I would be a genius if I could remember dimensions for the canvases,
Hmm.
and I don't quite remember. But I will say off the bat that they are not by any means small. We're not
Okay.
thinking, she has some flower paintings are about this big, and those tend to be the very small ones, but it would have certainly been bigger than that. So they were not small by any means. And that goes for the poppy and the red canna. Um, I can also recommend that you visit the George O'Keeffe Museum Collections online website. You can type it into Google, and if you search up the title of the painting, it'll immediately give you dimensions. And
Wow.
you can see, you can also search by subject. So if you want to look at all of the poppies, you can. If you want to look at all of the
Mhm.
petunias, all of her
Wow.
roses, and so on and so forth, filter by subject matter, you can.
Wow. Thank you. We have a few more questions with a little bit more time. Are you familiar with the book Modern Nature written during the exhibition of the same name curated by Aaron Coe and focused on O'Keeffe's landscapes of Lake George at the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls, New York?
If we are thinking of the same book, then yes, definitely. I'm pretty sure we're thinking of the same one. I don't want to conflate it with the Poetry of Things, which was another O'Keeffe exhibition. But if the one you're talking about is a catalog for an exhibition exclusively dedicated to Lake George, then yes, that book really, if for all of you who are on the call, I would take note of that book that was just in the chat if you are more interested. It's an excellent, excellent book that really does a deep dive into Lake George. And I think really does justice to a lot of the work that came out of Lake George and how important and related it is to, while they're different, there is a relationship there between Lake George and the work in New Mexico, especially the early New Mexico years.
Mm, yeah, thank you. Do you have any sense of the friendship she developed with other women who visited the Adirondacks on a regular basis?
Yes. Mixed. I kept it mentioning, that she was upset with the very steady, well, maybe not upset all of the time, but that sometimes it was sort of getting in the way of the need for concentration. I think if we're writers, if we're artists, musicians, there comes a moment where you have to hone your craft. And there were those moments of tension where she clearly really wanted just a moment to herself for concentration. She's also at the family's compound. It's not essentially her own house. And that is why I mentioned New Mexico being
Mhm,
sort of a house of her own, and no pun intended
mhm,
on Virginia Woolf. But yes, she had, going back to the women at Lake George, it was varied. For Rebecca Salisbury James, who stays there when she marries Paul Strand, who's an incredibly important photographer and friends with Stiglitz, they had a very, very incredible relationship, and it was reciprocal, and
mhm,
which is why from that friendship at Lake George, they decide to travel together to New Mexico. And when we think about that time in 20th century, in the 20th century, it wasn't
mhm.
totally normal for, or at least for women to travel out on their own, and they did it
Yeah.
anyway, which is pretty
Mhm,
groundbreaking for the women. And so I will say there were friendships that emerged from there, and there were also tensions with other women because
mhm,
of Stieglitz's. I won't go into the hot gossip with Alfred Stieglitz, but the
mhm,
affair and so on and so forth.
mhm. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Um, was she the only successful female artist in the group she was linked with at Lake George,
You
or were there
know,
others?
that in many ways, yes.
Mhm,
And there were other women that she was trying to support. I really recommend, I don't want to circumnavigate the presentation, but I really recommend that you look at Rebecca Salisbury James' work. That's a woman artist trying to make it into the Stieglitz Circle, who
mhm,
is repeatedly not encouraged by the Stieglitz
mhm,
Circle. And that's mainly because she is also trying to grapple with domestic subjects that I mentioned, like flowers and
mhm,
um, flowers in vases and fruit bowls and things like that that weren't totally encouraged by this predominantly male
mhm,
circle. And so O'Keeffe was probably the most well accepted. Um, and she had trouble. She also didn't want to be recognized as just being a woman artist. She wanted to be
mhm,
recognized as an artist and didn't want a
mhm.
pigeonholed label. But to answer your question, yeah,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Um, Another question, where is the hill again? I think this was probably you were talking about something in Lake George. I
Yes.
missed where you said it was located along Lake George, and is it still there?
I'm not sure if it is still there or not, but it's
Mhm.
positioned across Bolton Road and overlooking a stretch of the lake shore. And
Okay.
I've not myself traveled to upstate New York since I was at NYU, and we would, take our spring break there, but I cannot for the life of me remember the specificity. Um, but there is, I recommend you doing gosh, I can't remember which university has sort of like a blog post. It might be Yale on
Mhm.
the Oakland House and the Hill House. Just
Okay.
recommend that you do a quick Google search on that.
Okay. Thank you. What influenced your work on this subject? Anything surprise you or made you smile and glad you chose this topic?
Yes, because I think part of it was how important Lake George becomes for her to really closely study nature. And I work at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we are in Santa Fe, New Mexico because it was so important for O'Keeffe, and that's why it makes sense to have the museum
Mhm.
there. But her close study and observation at Lake George is so pivotal for understanding the importance of her work in New Mexico. I think also, I may have concluded with this, but it also allows her to really do that sort of like internal and external interrogation of what are my needs as a human
Mhm.
and as an artist. And my gosh, I require a house of my own. I mean, there was
Mhm.
that early tension with her not really being the biggest fan of really ornate Victorian furnishing. She really wanted more of an aesthetic that was in allegiance to her artistic vision. And so I think that that really intrigues me, this idea of having Lake George give her so much inspiration, but also allow her to really meditate on what she needs, especially as she is entering a mature age in her career later on in New Mexico.
Thank you. Did she keep painting nature even after moving to New York City?
She did, and one thing I will say is while the first sort of enlarged and cropped and magnified botanical subject, which was the petunia, is created at Lake George, she goes on to once they leave the retreat and go back to their apartment in Manhattan every year. She would
Mhm.
still continue pursuing these magnified floral paintings in New York, as well as her skyscrapers. I encourage everybody to take a look at the Art Institute of Chicago's My New York's exhibition, which came down, but the catalog is fantastic. So in New York, she really is creating and abstracting floral subjects that are in strong opposition to the industrialization, like the steamboat engines and the skyscrapers being built. I mean, she was living there at a time where
Mhm.
we don't see as much construction now in Manhattan, but she was living there at a time where skyscrapers are being built
Wow,
actively every day. So yes, she was still engaging with it, and it was sort of a response to industrialization.
thank you. When she painted the Tongue Mountain, do you know where she painted those from?
What was that again?
When she painted Tongue Mountain, am I pronouncing that? Tongue Jew Mountain? I might not
Let's
pronounce.
see. Okay, for a second there, I thought you were talking about the cow with the little
Yeah,
tongue. Is it the last landscape with
it
the
might
moon?
be. Yeah.
Okay, that is one of the very last landscapes because
Mhm.
after that, you see a really vivid shift towards the landscapes of New Mexico.
Ah,
And she's engaging more with the landscapes of New Mexico than she is with Lake George, especially after that initial trip in 1929.
ah, thank you. We got a question. I wanted to ask what drew you to Georgia O'Keeffe's time here in Lake George?
What drew me to Georgia O'Keeffe's time at Lake George? Let's see. Well, I think one thing that's so important to recognize, and one thing that we actively do at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, because we get a lot of questions like, where are her flower paintings? How did she make her flower paintings? It is her most
Hmm.
iconic work and her most well-known work for a lot of people globally. And I think too, what intrigues me is that Lake George serves as this place where she can really start to dive into this idea
Hmm.
um, that originated in New York, but that she can really deep dive and focus and hone it. That really interests me about like George, as well as what I had earlier mentioned about sort of her interrogating this idea of selfhood as a working artist.
Yeah, thank you. Another question. How do you see O'Keeffe's time in Texas and the work she created while there in relation to her formative time in Lake George?
The Texas years are so pivotal. Um, when we look at the Texas years, She is in, you can also tell that she's looking for that self and she's experimenting with subject matter, but she's also really beginning to eye and to observe and study nature. Um, and especially begins to immerse herself in the landscapes of the Southwest that will clearly define her later life before her death. Um, the other thing about Texas is she also has these incredible watercolors where she's looking at women doing laundry and she depicts watercolors of women hanging clothes and men selling fruit vendors and and then she's got landscapes and she's featuring things like crows over mountains. It's a time of intense experimentation as a young artist finding their voice. And that is so important because Lake George allows for more, I'm now a professional artist. Stiglitz is sort of selling and commercializing my art. Now I'm engaging more with the practice as a professionally paid artist, as opposed to the period where young art students are trying to figure out their voice.
Yeah, thank you. We got another, this is a comment and then a question. I appreciated the comment you made about the small tears in the leaves for some works being symbolic or tears in the leaves. Are there other adjustments that which she included in her Lake George works which have symbolism?
You know, I'm trying to think um, off of the top of my head, and and I will just say what my brain immediately wants to go back to is that really weird architectural sort of, it's not weird, it's beautiful, but it's so perplexing because architecturally it has no logic to the eye that the door and the window are merged as one. But that one, when you think about it too, I think there's more to it
Mhm.
that can be sort of honed in by a scholar about the meaning behind the window as a place where
Mhm.
you are looking from the inside outside and blurring nature, but also thinking about sort of interiority of experience and exteriority of experience without them being a dichotomy. But that one is really interesting because even though she is painting some of those landscapes from that bedroom window that I mentioned before, she really transitions to the shanty. She
Mhm.
doesn't really depict the window. She doesn't really depict the house until that trip in 1929. It's almost like I know that my time here has concluded and my eye and my heart is somewhere else now, and that is New Mexico. She also has this pivotal quote from 1928, right before that trip, where she's talking about needing that she's losing herself through that experience, that turbulent
Mhm.
experience, even though it was really giving and flourishing, and that she really needs to do something about it. And so that trip to New Mexico is her doing something about it. But yeah, going back to the poetic symbolism behind that painting, it's really interesting. I wonder what she was thinking about. It's also
Mhm.
very nostalgic, the colors are, um,
Mhm.
and solemn.
Thank you. I think we'll do one more question. Can you speak to her connection to I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, a Weowako in Lake George? Does that
To what was that?
Weowako?
Let's see. Um,
It's it's near the site of her, sorry, their house. It's near the site of her house.
near there's a Rio Chama.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure what body of water that would be. Also,
Mhm.
O'Keeffe kept two houses, one at Ghost Ranch, and then which is also in northern New Mexico, and then one just a couple miles away in Abiquiu, New Mexico. But she is also engaging with bodies of water there, except they're not necessarily large lakes, but rather these sort of smaller rivers.
Okay, thank you. And then, all right, we'll take one more. I read that O'Keeffe was friends with Frida Kahlo, the Lindberghs, Joni Mitchell, Allen Ginsberg, Ansel Adams, to name a few. Did any of these individuals have any influence on her work, thoughts, or life actions in any way?
Yeah, we got so many questions of the two, Frida
Mhm,
Kahlo being the one of the most recognizable women artists on the other side of the border in Mexico, and then you've got Georgia O'Keeffe in the US, and they did have a dialogue, and
mhm,
O'Keeffe did travel to Mexico and visited her, um, to answer your question. But yes, one thing that I will say when you do research on O'Keeffe is that she's not insulated from other artists. There's a reciprocal dialogue between all of them that is very circular. It's the art doesn't exist within a vacuum. She's, reading Kandinsky. She's influenced by Arthur Dove.
mhm,
Marsden Hartley is looking at her floral subjects and engaging with them as well. So all of them, are doing having a reciprocal exchange and relationship with, which can be very beautiful.
mhm. Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
And
thank you, Yari. Meg, this was absolutely a wonderful program. As you can see from the questions and the comments, I think we had every single person who was watching tonight sent a wonderful comment about how much they appreciated this program. So I'm Cheryl Bronstein. I am the Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience, and we wanted to thank all of you for joining us tonight. This was such an incredible program. And we are thrilled that this region played such an instrumental role in Georgia O'Keeffe's development as an artist. We hope you all enjoyed this program and this series. 3 weeks from tonight, we will be wrapping up our season with Albany Public Library. On April 8th, we'll have a program featuring Paul Grondel, who will be sharing insights into Teddy Roosevelt's famous Midnight Ride to the Presidency, which marks its 125th anniversary this year. So another fabulous person in American history who will be featuring that evening. Again, Yari, thank you so very much, and we hope everybody has a good night.
thank you,
Bye.
Mari. Bye.